In the early years of the internet, online scams were almost comical in their simplicity. An email from a so-called Nigerian prince promising millions in exchange for a small processing fee. A stern message from the IRS demanding iTunes gift cards. A vague notice about an inheritance from a cousin you had never heard of. These tricks, poorly written and transparent, preyed mostly on the elderly, and the sums stolen were relatively small. A few $100s here, a few hundred there. For the most part, they were seen as nuisances rather than existential threats. Then, in 2021, everything changed. Online fraud mutated into something far more effective and far more dangerous. The victims were no longer just isolated seniors unfamiliar with technology. They were CEOs, police officers, even financial advisors, the kinds of people you would expect to recognize a con when they saw one. Instead of losing pocket change, victims were losing life savings. Surveys found that the median victim lost $100,000. A third of them were driven into debt. The typical target was just 37 years old, educated, tech-savvy, and supposedly too cautious to be fooled. Somehow, scams had leapt in sophistication seemingly overnight, leaving authorities and ordinary people equally blindsided. To make sense of this sudden transformation, researchers dug into the data. Kevin May and Professor John Griffin at the University of Texas examined thousands of cryptocurrency transactions linked to these schemes. When they looked only at U.S. exchanges like Coinbase and Gemini, the scams really did appear to erupt out of nowhere in 2021. But a broader look revealed that these operations had been running for years elsewhere, mostly in China. The frauds that devastated Americans were not new inventions at all. They were perfected abroad and only later unleashed on Western targets. To understand how that happened, the story has to reach back decades to the uneasy relationship between the Chinese state and organized crime. When the Communist Party took power in 1949, it cracked down not only on intellectuals and entrepreneurs, but also on criminal syndicates. Many fled to Hong Kong and Macau, which were then under British and Portuguese control. In Hong Kong, triads embedded themselves in society, while in Macau, they found an ideal environment. Gambling was legal there, and casinos were fertile ground for laundering money and settling debts. Violence was common, turf wars broke out in the streets, and corruption became routine. When Macau was handed back to China in 1999, many assumed the triads' reign was over. Beijing wanted stability and prosperity, not gangsterism. But the government struck an unusual bargain. American casino giants were invited to invest billions in Macau, and in exchange, triads, rebranded as junkets, were allowed to continue operating as middlemen. They courted wealthy gamblers in mainland China, loaned them chips, and arranged VIP rooms where the stakes were high and discretion guaranteed. They also enforced debts the casinos could not legally pursue. This arrangement generated staggering sums. By 2019, Macau's casinos earned $36 billion, triple the revenue of Las Vegas, and half of that came from junket-run VIP rooms. The deal could not last forever. Xi Jinping, who came to power in 2012, viewed Macau's junket system as a breeding ground for corruption. Officials were funneling fortunes out of China, and the triads had become too powerful. In 2021, the head of Macau's largest junket was arrested and sentenced to 18 years in prison. Overnight, the high-roller business collapsed. Beijing wanted Macau to become family-friendly, more like Las Vegas, even if that meant slower growth. The triads had to adapt. Their next move was Southeast Asia. Cambodia, the Philippines, and Thailand offered casinos and special economic zones where police oversight was weak. Myanmar, rocked by a military coup in 2021, was even better. The state controlled only fragments of the country, leaving vast regions lawless. Triads set up operations there, building casinos and luring wealthy Chinese gamblers to play beyond Beijing's reach. But almost as soon as they settled in, the pandemic struck. China sealed its borders, and the flow of gamblers dried up. Remote gambling, where players bet from their phones while watching dealers via livestream, proved less profitable, so the triads turned to a different scheme: online scamming. At first glance, online fraud was nothing new. But what they developed was different in scale, method, and cruelty. Instead of quick thefts, these new scams were long-term psychological manipulations. They became known as pig butchering. It often began with a wrong number text. "Is this Kevin?" the stranger would ask. You reply, "No." "Oh, sorry, I thought you were my roommate from Boise State. Go Broncos." Maybe by chance, or maybe by design, that happened to be your alma mater. The small coincidence sparked familiarity. Unlike old scams, this one did not demand money right away. The stranger became a companion. They messaged you every day, asked about your family, remembered your dog's name, recommended TV shows. Weeks passed, sometimes months. Trust grew. Eventually, the conversation turned to money. Your new friends spoke of how well they were doing with cryptocurrency investments. They offered to help you pay off debts or save for retirement. Cautiously, you invested a small sum, $200. A week later, you withdrew $220. It felt real because at this stage, it was real. The scammer wanted to build faith. Then came the push for larger sums. Encouraged by early gains, you poured in thousands, perhaps even borrowed from family or maxed out credit cards. Then, one day, the exchange you were using disappeared. The website was a fake, built to mimic a real platform. Your money, along with your friend, was gone. Pig butchering was devastating because it exploited both wallets and hearts. Victims lost life savings, but they also lost what felt like a genuine relationship. And unlike earlier scams, this model required time and effort, hours of daily chatting, patient manipulation, and detailed research into victims' lives. That raised an important question. Who had the time to run these elaborate operations? The answer lay in the scam compounds of Myanmar. Recruiters targeted vulnerable Chinese job seekers with promises of high pay in Thailand. Once they arrived, their passports were confiscated, and they were smuggled across the border into Myanmar. There, in guarded compounds, they were forced to work as scammers. They lived in dormitories, ate in cafeterias, and spent up to 16 hours a day messaging targets abroad. Violence and abuse were common for those who refused. It was a system of modern slavery, combining the low costs of sweatshop labor with the high profits of luxury fraud. The scale was enormous. The United Nations estimated that 300,000 people were trapped in such compounds. The United States Institute of Peace calculated that online scams generated $12.5 billion annually in Cambodia alone, nearly a third of the country's GDP. For years, most of the victims were Chinese, but as Beijing began to crack down, the triads shifted their focus outward, toward Europe, Canada, and especially the United States. China eventually grew alarmed at the damage. Public anger was rising as billions were siphoned out of citizens' pockets. In 2021, Beijing banned cryptocurrency entirely, cutting off a crucial payment channel for scammers. It pressured Myanmar's junta to act, and by 2023, some scam workers were being deported. But the underlying structures remained, and the triads simply redirected their efforts toward foreign victims. That is how pig butchering arrived in the United States seemingly overnight. From the American perspective, it looked like a new, sudden wave of fraud. In reality, it was the latest stage of a decades-long evolution of organized crime, shaped by the interplay between Beijing's crackdowns and the triads' relentless adaptability. Each time China suppressed them, they re-emerged elsewhere, stronger than before. From Macau's casinos to Myanmar's compounds, they refined their methods until they were ready to unleash them on America's unsuspecting middle class. The tragedy is that the scam leaves more than empty bank accounts. It leaves behind shattered trust, broken hearts, and lingering shame. Victims are often too embarrassed to come forward, convinced they should have known better. But the sophistication of pig butchering is precisely what makes it effective. It weaponizes patience, research, and human connection. It transforms loneliness into vulnerability and turns friendship into betrayal. For Washington, the challenge now mirrors Beijing's dilemma decades earlier. Arresting a few scammers or banning a website addresses the symptoms, not the cause. The real problem lies in the lawless spaces where these operations thrive. As long as countries like Myanmar remain unstable, organized crime will find shelter. And as history shows, pushing triads out of one territory only drives them into another. The story of pig butchering is not just about scams, it is about the global movement of organized crime, the unintended consequences of state crackdowns, and the ways instability ripples across borders. It is about how an old triad network, once ferrying gamblers to Macau, now manipulates strangers on smartphones thousands of miles away. And it is about how, in a world full of wealth and loneliness, the most dangerous crime of all may be the one that begins with a simple, friendly message. Is this Kevin?